At the present time, we are experiencing a particularly fortunate state of existence as human beings. We have this precious human existence, which is endowed with 8 different kinds of freedom and 10 different kinds of opportunities, which make it the perfect basis for spiritual practice. We have the freedom to practice if we wish. We have the ability to apply spiritual teachings in our life and attain enlightenment through this practice. But one thing that we should remember is that this precious human existence is not something permanent. It's not something that is going to last even for a very long time, let alone forever. It is impermanent. It is something which will not remain. Just how is this world that we experience impermanent? The Buddha described it as being limited in a number of ways. Because in this universe in which we live, the end of all birth is death. The end of all coming together or meeting is parting. The end of all gathering is dispersal, and the end of all building up is breaking down. Nothing in this universe, nothing that we experience has any kind of stability or solidity to it on any permanent or eternal level. Everything that we experience comes together at a certain point and falls away at a certain point. This is as true of our own physical bodies as anything else. Because this impermanence that we experience is a momentary process. There is a moment-by-moment process of aging from birth to death. It is not as though one is born a baby and then at a certain point, a number of years later, one suddenly becomes a grown-up person. And then a number of years after that, one day one suddenly becomes old or suddenly dies. It isn't that kind of process. Minute by minute, moment by moment, the individual is changing from the moment that conception occurs until the moment that death occurs. And it's rather like looking at a river. To just look at the river from a distance, superficially, you think of it being something eternal. There's always this river. But if you understand the nature of the river, and if you go and sit and look carefully at the river, you see that every second the water that was here is being replaced by the new water coming, and the old water is going. So in a certain sense, there's a new river every moment. It is never the same. It may look the same on a kind of general level if you take a brief look at it. But to look at it in minute detail is to see that it is always changing. So is everything else that we experience, moment by moment. Now, ideally, one might feel, well, my youth, my early years, this is the time when I achieve some degree of success in the world and establish my security. And then when I'm older, later on in my life, when I have more time, I'll get around to practicing Dharma. Then I'll start to do some spiritual practice. That would be fine if we could be assured that we were going to live that long. We really don't know. One of the characteristics of the world we live in as human beings is that there is no fixed span of life for any individual. Some people die while they're still in their mother's womb before they're born. They are born, stillborn or dead. Some babies die shortly after birth. Some children die in infancy. Some die in their teens. Some die in their teens. Some die in early adulthood. And, of course, some people do live to be old and die in their old age. But there's no guarantee in any one individual's situation that the person is going to live for so many years, and that's guaranteed. It simply is not the case that we can count on that kind of length of life. which means that we do need to use the opportunity that we have as quickly as possible. The teachings of Dharma, the practice of these teachings, becomes something very immediate and something very important if one realizes that the opportunity that one has to practice may not last very long at all. One really doesn't know. In a culture such as Europe or North America, it is very difficult for someone to, at present, to devote their entire life to Dharma, to just completely put away any concern with the world and devote their entire body, speech, and mind to the practice of Dharma. Even if the person would want to, it would be difficult for them to find a place to stay and have enough to eat and so forth. There just isn't the support for that kind of practice yet. It either is not something in the person themselves, or it's something that the culture does not yet support. But that doesn't mean that we're hopeless. It doesn't mean that there is no way to practice, because practice can be very successfully integrated with one's daily activities. There is a saying in Tibet that even speaking or working with one's hands can be virtuous activity. Even walking and sitting down can be negative activity. It depends upon one's outlook, depends upon one's motivation. With the proper approach, one can learn to incorporate the practice of virtue and the practice of Dharma into one's daily activities.
Lama Chökyi
If one is continually aware of impermanence and continually aware of the opportunity and freedom that one has in the human birth, then one finds that even if one's still involved in the world and still has a lot of activity taking up one's time and energy, that quite naturally one can begin to incorporate the practice of Dharma into one's life. One can begin every morning when one gets up. The first thing one does in the morning is to reaffirm the taking of refuge, developing this heartfelt devotion to one's gurus, to the three jewels, and taking refuge, even a matter of reciting the refuge prayer 7 times with this attitude of faith and devotion, this trust in the sources of refuge. This maintains the connection of refuge and brings one under the blessing and protection of the three jewels. It opens one to this source of blessing and benefit. As well, one can develop the attitude every morning of bodhicitta, one's compassionate and altruistic concern for all beings in whatever one does, whether it is the formal practice of Dharma or just some ordinary activity during the day. One can begin every day with this idea: in order to bring each and every sentient being to full enlightenment and to greater states of happiness before that attainment of enlightenment, I will do whatever I do today, physically, verbally, and mentally. All of this is for the benefit of all beings. If one has those kind of attitudes, beginning each day with the taking of refuge and the development of this bodhicitta, this altruistic motivation, then whatever one does, even if one's just sitting quietly by oneself, becomes a kind of virtuous activity, because it is within the spirit of the practice of Dharma. Every night before one goes to sleep, one can review the day, how the day has gone, and appreciate any of the virtuous action or meditation practice or whatever one's been able to do during the day. And whatever the virtue of that practice is, or that activity is, all of that is dedicated for the benefit of all beings. So it isn't something that one simply leaves on a personal level, but one reiterates that this is for the benefit of all beings, and dedicates it in that way. Now, the concept of the dedication of merit is a very important one, and could be a very complex one to try and understand. But simply speaking, it is the attitude that one is attempting to emulate the example of the gurus and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past, and that just as these beings dedicated their merit for the benefit of all beings, and in this way attained to enlightenment, one is attempting to follow this example and to do the same. That is the basic spirit of dedicating one's merit and one's virtue. So, by beginning each day with the taking of refuge and the generation of one's bodhicitta, and by concluding every day with this dedication of one's merit and virtue, and prayers of aspiration for future development of oneself, of all beings, in this way, one will find that even the most mundane daily activity starts to take on a dharmic quality. It begins to partake of the virtue of dharma practice, and one finds that more and more the values of dharma practice come into everything that one does. So at that point, one's activity in the world is not an obstacle. It can be a vehicle for one to bring these qualities of dharma into being. If one is continually aware of death and impermanence, then one will find that one always has the necessary energy and motivation to practice whenever the opportunity presents itself. But if one's always putting things off and procrastinating and thinking, well, that's for later, that's for the future, I can do that later, then one's going to find one's life becomes very busy and very distracted, and one simply can't get that kind of time and energy and motivation. It'll be very difficult. There's a saying in Tibet, don't think so much of the future. If you think too much of the future, you're like Dawadrakpa's father. Now, the way to explain that is to tell the story about Dawa Drakpa's father, of course. Now, the story behind the proverb concerns a certain Lama who was on pilgrimage once, going from holy place to holy place in Tibet. And at a certain point, he came to an area where there lived a very poor beggar. And this man had gathered together a pot of barley to make some tsamba flour or whatever, but he had this pot of grain that he begged from various people. And for someone like him, for a poor beggar like him, it was quite a prize. And he was very careful that it was not going to be stolen or that mice weren't going to eat it, and so he hung it from the ceiling of his house, of his little shack, and he hung it from a rope, and he used to sleep right under it to make sure that nobody would come and steal it. Now, while the Lama was in this area, a certain event occurred that the Lama was aware of through his meditation, and it was this event that became the basis for the proverb. What happened was that one night this poor man was lying down to sleep, and he started to think to himself, and he kept thinking about this pot of grain that he had hanging up there, and he kept thinking, I could really make my fortune with that. If I'm very careful, I could use that to make some good samba and sell that, and then I could take the profit from that and buy some more and invest in this, and then I could slowly build up a fortune. And he was sitting there gloating to himself and thinking, I could get richer and richer and richer, and I'd be rich enough to get married finally, and I could get a very good wife, and we'd be so happy together, and we'd have a son, a boy. And now what would I call my son? And just as he was lying there in bed trying to think of what he would call his son, he saw the moon rise through the window. And so he thought, I'll call my son Dawa Drakpa, which means in Tibet, famous moon. Dawa means moon and Drakpa means fame or good reputation. And so he decided to call his son Dawa Drakpa when a mouse that had been eating at the cord cut through the cord, and the pot of grain fell down and hit him on the heart and killed him. That's what they mean when they say, don't think too much of the future, because if you do, you're like Dawa Drakpa's father. Nothing may ever come of it.
What about the Lama?
The Lama comes into the story simply because the Lama was aware through his meditation of what had happened to this man while he was in that area. And the Lama used that as an example to people, to show them the uselessness of thinking about the future. And so it was the Lama who made up this proverb that became very famous in Tibet. We have physical body, we have speech, and we have mind. The most important level is the mind, is the attitudes that we have. Because this conditions how our physical and verbal actions will be, whether they will be positive or negative. If one has certain qualities of mind, such as faith and trust, such as compassion, such as wisdom, then whatever one does becomes virtuous. Because the physical and verbal actions simply follow in the wake of these positive qualities. There is a story of a small boy who was walking down the street, and he had a handful of dried peas that he was eating as a kind of snack. And he came upon a Buddha that was walking in the other direction towards him, and the Buddha was begging from door to door for food. And the little boy, when he saw the Buddha, he was just filled immediately with a very pure faith and trust in the Buddha. And just without thinking, he took the remaining peas in his hand and just offered them to the Buddha. Now 4 of them fell into the Buddha's bowl, and several others struck the Buddha on the heart, and one of them struck the Buddha on the center of the forehead. Now, the result of that act, the karmic tendency that faith and that act established, ripened in a future lifetime with the consciousness of that boy taking rebirth as a universal monarch, as an extremely rich and powerful king, with dominion over 4 huge continents, which were the result of the 4 peas having fallen into the Buddha's bowl. The fact that some of the other peas struck the Buddha in the heart was the act that created the karmic tendency that resulted in the fact that this king not only had dominion over the human realm, but also over the God's realm as well. And the fact that one of the peas struck the Buddha in the forehead was the act that eventually culminated with the king not only attaining power and influence in the world, but also developing spiritually and attaining enlightenment himself. That was a very small act for that little boy, but it was done with such pure faith and confidence that it became a very powerful act. So these kinds of qualities, faith and compassion and wisdom, they give a great deal of power and a great deal of virtue to whatever one does. Compassion is another one of these qualities which makes even a small act a very powerful one karmically. During the time of the Lord Buddha, there was a king in India whose name was Saja, who was one of the wealthiest and most powerful and influential kings in the whole of India at that time, Saja. And this king Saja was in such a position of wealth and power and influence that to most people he seemed like some kind of god instead of a human being. And a number of people asked the Buddha at one point, what is the karmic cause of this king's rebirth as this rich and powerful individual? What kind of karma, what kind of action could he have committed in some previous lifetime to bring about this rebirth as a king? And the Buddha replied, at a certain point the consciousness of this king was in a human state of rebirth in some previous lifetime. And on that occasion, this human being met another human being who was very poor, a starving beggar who had absolutely no food and was in a terrible state. And out of pure compassion, motivated by nothing but the most pure and sincere compassion, this person gave a single handful of warm food, warm rice or whatever, warm food to this starving person. But it was done with such purity of heart, it was done with such sincere compassion, that karmic tendency resulted in the mind of that person taking rebirth as this rich and powerful king in India. So this quality of compassion, of true and sincere altruism, is another very powerful element that can make even the smallest act very powerful on a karmic level.
소소 뭐 대파도 이제 야빠야나 그래서 저거체 제가 부지도 정말 또 맨날 진짜서 타가르스 가르스나 내가 손제 좀 내는 잡고사자가 진짜 이제 손제도 좀 맞아 야 나왔으면 이거 무슨 좀 희발스 내가 미지의 공식 소화도 잘 제대로 그래 잡고 후한자가 알았어 다들이가 가서 손제도 좀 맞아 좀 바꿔 와서 되게 계속 거기서 잡고사자도 손제 맞지 네 뭐하도 하나 손제 자게 알았어 내가 그랬더니 어머 어제 가면 바로 또 그랬다 어머니 알았어 어머니 그 잡고사자도 저러고만 찾잖아 걸어 따바로 손제 걸게 바로 나를 쳐봐 퍼트 바지 건너서 옆으로 사가이 주세요 참모를 자게 알았어 대체다 근데 마치 손제 쓰네 근데 내가 잡고서 처럼 하고 처럼은 그 서로 초소 자체와 되는 거고 나 간에서 나서 잡고 간 거래서 잡고서는 나를 초소 자체와 있어 나가도 되는데 다 이나요 되는 소재가 참여해서 다 나를 초소 자체와 되는 되는 거는 살이지 되는 소재가 엄마들이 매년 비비에 내가 하면서 말했어. 그래 가에 나서만 맞지 좀 말했어. 다 대신에 이미 그래 뭐 엄마들로 미는 거 맞아서 말했어. 그래 옆에서 저 서로 생각하는 다 나로 제발 자체부터도 피나 마음 다 간에 들어서 생각하는 거는 그래 람보서 말이 잡고 나지도 나는 그 마태와 가르치더래. 그 나스니까 무슨 말이지? 대선들은 레버리 빠지기가 다탱아 타에 잡았잖아. 투파는 그시나. 그러나 뭐들 내가지가 그것을 소화하는 거가 되네. 시도라서 벌써 건너서 좀 뭐 돈에 되네. 대충해서라. 되네. 뭐 살아 또 좋지 말아야지. 그냥 살았던 까라 그냥 오버면 뭐 터지거나 이런 까라 근데 터서도 싫어 제대로 주스 되는 하파 아까 어머니 미즈나 대를 싫어 사람하는 게 대신 주스네 너무 하파르지 근데 되는 기준에 그것이 좀 근데 그것이 또 까라 근데 오버 총하게 흙잡에 까라 근데 심멘트 싫어 dançores né? Chamado Tipacharo Sasmares, tem Gaia de Seron, Majores, né? Sonjega, a Sosicata Cala, né? Jabosaja Minis, Matas Maris, né? Takata Wakaina, Sonjega, de Santa Cala, né? Sonjega, né? Mamata Bosaja, Sana Chamboris, Ina Intelligent, né? Samacha, Omata Gaia Seron, and the Tapaza, the Telephone. There guys are co-centering the guy just a magic. Jabosaja, that's it, and I was about this. That's it. So Macron's changes.
If one has these qualities of faith and trust and these qualities of compassion, then even though one might not be a wealthy person at all, one might not have any physical possessions or any material wealth to speak of. But that doesn't mean that one is limited in one's ability to practice virtue and accumulate merit and behave in positive ways. Because what is really most important is one's motivation. The story which is often told to illustrate this point relates an incident during the Buddha's life when this same king, Saja, was the Buddha's patron. And he was sponsoring a 3-month meditation retreat that the Buddha and a number of his disciples, 500 of his disciples, were taking part in one summer during the rainy season. And for this 3-month period, the king was offering everything that was needed, food and lodging and so forth, to the Buddha and these 500 disciples. And every day after the noon meal, the Buddha would dedicate the merit of all of their dharma activity for the benefit of all beings. And because the king was the principal patron, the Buddha would always honor that generosity by saying, today we dedicate all of the merit and all of the virtue of all of this dharma activity for the benefit of all beings, particularly King Saja. This was a gesture of honor to acknowledge the faith and the generosity of this patron. Now, in that area there lived a number of beggars, among them an old beggar woman who nevertheless had even though she was a very poor person, very unimportant, she had a very pure heart. And when she saw all this activity going on, all of the meditation and teaching and so forth, and she saw the king being such a generous patron, she was very impressed. She really admired that kind of activity as the king's. And she used to think to herself, that is really wonderful that the king is doing that, all of that virtue for the benefit of all beings. That is really such a fine thing. And there was not a trace of jealousy in her mind at all. She was really sincerely impressed and admired, rejoiced in the merit of this king. And when she gave rise to this attitude one day, seeing this activity going on, that day the Buddha said after the noon meal, he said to the king, today should I dedicate the merit for your benefit or for the benefit of someone who has even more merit than you? And the king was a little surprised and he thought, well, can there really be somebody with more merit than me? Well, the Buddha must know what he's talking about. So he felt that he ought to say the humble thing. So he said, well, if there is somebody with more merit than me, then please dedicate the virtue on their behalf. So the Buddha said, we dedicate the merit today for the benefit of all beings, particularly this old beggar woman. And he named this old beggar woman, at which point everybody was very surprised. Nobody said anything. This went on for several days, and every day the Buddha would name this old beggar woman as the foremost among all sentient beings for whom the merit and virtue was being dedicated. Now, the king became very depressed because he really couldn't understand why there was someone who had more merit than he did in this situation, because he was providing all of the food, he was providing all of the places to stay and everything, he was being the generous patron, and someone else was getting all the credit. So, one of his ministers became aware of this situation, was quite an intelligent fellow, but was not a particularly kind person, this minister. And he arranged a certain trick to be played on this old woman so that the situation would be returned to its previous state. And one day when the servants were bringing in, the king's servants were bringing in the food for everyone to eat at lunchtime, in the middle of the day, the minister said to some of the servants, when you take in this tray of fruit, when you go past the gate where all the beggars are, make sure you drop the fruit on the ground. And when all the beggars come to grab the fruit, kick them and beat them and make them go away. But especially that old woman. And he pointed her out to them. And she said, you see that old woman over there, so-and-so? Well, when she comes to get the fruit, kick her and beat her and just really be hard on her. Don't let her have a moment's peace, and just kick her out of here. So as these servants were carrying the food in, they had to follow the minister's order. He was the one who gave them their orders, their leader. So they dropped the fruit on the ground, and in came all the beggars, of course, running to grab the fruit. And they started to lay on the beggars with sticks and kicking them, and especially this old woman. They beat her mercilessly. And she became absolutely furious, absolutely outraged. And the only thing at that point in her mind was absolute hatred for the king, for the servants, for everybody. And she lost all of that pure admiration that she had had for the king's generosity. Now, the king knew nothing of this. This was the minister's trick that he had played. But that day when the Buddha was asked to share the merit, he said again, we dedicate the merit and virtue of all of this activity for the benefit of all beings, particularly the King Saja. And people were again surprised. First they were surprised when the Buddha had changed the name in the first place, and now they were even more surprised that he changed it back, seemingly for no reason. So people couldn't help at this point but ask the Buddha, why did you do this? What is going on here? And the Buddha said, well, originally it was the king that had the most merit, because he really was doing this out of generosity and faith. But this old woman had such purity of heart. Her admiration and her rejoicing in the merit of the king was so pure that she, in fact, had the most merit in the situation. Simply by rejoicing in the merit of another, she gained more merit than that person, the king himself. But today, all that there is in her mind is hatred and anger. And unfortunately, she has lost that admiration. And in the situation, it still remains the king who has the most merit and the most virtue. So this was very instructive for the people to understand that motivation is a very important thing. And it was unfortunate that the old woman had lost that motivation in the situation, because that had been such a pure motivation that it really had been incredibly meritorious for her. So it is really true that to speak of virtuous and non-virtuous behavior, or positive or negative action, one's really looking most at the motivation behind the action instead of the superficial action itself. Because the action is just a reflection or a shadow compared to the actual motivation. A person may be very generous. They may give a lot of money or a lot of offerings or whatever. Now to just look at it, it looks like a lot of virtue is going on. Very meritorious act, all of that wealth being given. But suppose the person is doing it because they want to become famous. They want people to respect them. They want people to look up to them and think they're wonderful. Or they're thinking of getting even more wealth by sharing this wealth, or something like that. If there's that personal vested interest, that selfish interest, then the actual karmic power of that action is very small. It's not a very positive action at all. A much smaller act with a more pure motivation would be far more powerful karmically. So on a karmic level, the virtue and the non-virtue, the positive and the negative karma, doesn't have so much to do with the superficial action as with the motivation. The motivation is proper, then the action, be it a big action or a small action, is very powerful. If the motivation is not correct, it can also be very powerful, very negative effect. But it doesn't have so much to do with the superficial action as with the motivation. And the third quality is wisdom and intelligence. And this is not a simple thing to understand at all. Wisdom can be seen in three different ways. There is intellectual wisdom, the ability to understand ideas. There is contemplative wisdom, and there is the wisdom that arises from meditation. Contemplation. Oh, I see. The first of these is, for example, when one's taking teaching and the teacher is talking about suffering or karma or the cycle of rebirth or the process, the path to liberation or the qualities of enlightened mind or something like that. And one understands what's being said, when really the concepts are quite clear in one's mind. One knows what one's being told and one can understand the meaning. That's a form of wisdom. That is an intellectual understanding, which is a form of wisdom. The next stage that's necessary is for one to actually work with that idea. Given that one understands the idea, one then begins to examine, well, is this really true or not? What is actually going on here? I understand the idea, but is this really something I can say that I thoroughly seen to be true? So one examines it until there is that kind of definitive understanding, that kind of really solid, definitive insight. Still on a conceptual level, but much deeper than just understanding the ideas. That's the second level of wisdom, which comes through contemplation. And the third kind is actual meditation. So that instead of being an idea or a concept, that becomes a direct experience. Whatever one is approaching in spiritual practice, one uses these three kinds of qualities. And the same is true for the situation here, where we're most concerned with Shine and Latong, with these two phases of meditation. And the way we approach it is on an intellectual level, on a contemplative level, and on a meditation level. To begin with, what is called shamatha in Sanskrit or shine in Tibetan is the first stage of meditation where one develops a tranquility of mind and a stability of mind. At the moment, the nature of mind is obscured by many factors, by fundamental ignorance, by emotional confusion, and the mind is really out of control. We have no way for the mind to remain undistracted, to remain quiet. It's continually out of control. It's like a monkey swinging through the trees in a forest, or like a spoiled child continually going after one thing and another without any sense of discipline. Because the mind is spoiled in this way, because it lacks this control and the freedom to simply remain in any given state without distraction, it's very difficult to meditate. Because the mind is compulsively distracted one way and the other and simply can't remain focused on the meditation. So regardless of the particular technique one is using, the first quality that one tries to develop is this sense of tranquility of mind, stability of mind. This is the benefit of shamatha. This is what the shamatha experience is. That the mind has been calmed and that all the disturbing influences of thoughts and emotions have been eliminated so that the mind can simply rest in any given state at will, ideally. And there's no need for the mind to be continually distracted from one thing to another. So that is the importance of the first stage of shamatha.
남수도 조시 여기 와르스. 대외에 남나 나한테 저기 와르스. 사회 남한테 나한테 또 바토면 남잖아. 전에 컨셉 와르스. 다 대우 많이 봐. 전에 했던 주나 더 넣으셔야 와르스. 그래 더 많이 봐. 다 돼서 거의 근데 전에 어떤 것에 판토 나서 트트스나 타바 손질 좀 하고요. 그래서 코디네이트 한번
Shamatha or shine can be either worldly or mundane, or it can be something transcendent, something that can lead to enlightenment. When one practices any kind of meditation and develops a certain quality of shine, of tranquility and stability of mind, then a number of different experiences can arise. Some of these will be experiences of bliss. Some of them will be experiences of the clarity and luminosity of mind. And some of them will be experiences of emptiness, a kind of non-conceptual state of awareness. Now these are simply signs that the meditation is taking place. But the problem is that one may fix on any one of these. One may cling to this and take it to be some kind of ultimate goal. If one clings to experiences of bliss, this is a cause of the mind taking rebirth in the future lifetime in the desire realm, the gods of the desire realm. If the mind focuses on and fixates on experiences of clarity or luminosity, this is the cause for rebirth in the form realm. And if the mind focuses on the experience of emptiness, non-conceptual awareness, and clings to this, then this is the cause of rebirth in the formless realm. And if the meditation goes wrong, and the mind is very dull during meditation, this can cause rebirth in the animal realm. So it is possible for the meditation to be very limited and to only be a cause for furthering the cycle of samsara. On the other hand, it may be that the practice of shine, of stability of mind, tranquility of mind, will bring the person to a point where platon, where vipassana or insight, deeper insight into the nature of mind can begin. If that is the case, then this path leads one to enlightenment. So it depends on how far one takes this shamatha meditation. If one stops before it has been carried to its fullest extent, then it will just be a cause of further rebirth in samsara. Otherwise, it will be the first stage of the mind transcending the cycle of samsara. In our practice of meditation, whether we are using a very mundane technique or a very spiritual technique, one which has some kind of transcendent quality to it, whatever we're using, we should keep in mind that our goal, our spiritual goal, is full and complete enlightenment. Now, this has two aspects to it. One of them is the personal benefit one gets from attaining enlightenment, of course. There is the dharmakaya aspect, the absolute or formless level of enlightened experience, which is the complete consummation or perfection of one's own benefit. But there is also the sambhogakaya and there is also the nirmanakaya, the form manifestations of enlightenment for the benefit of other beings. And so complete enlightenment also involves the ultimate benefit for others as well. This should be our goal, the ultimate benefit for self and others, full and complete enlightenment. In any practice of Dharma, to begin with the taking of refuge and the development of bodhicitta is very important. And to conclude the practice with prayers of dedication and aspiration is very important as well. If one is making sure that one's practice begins and concludes in the proper way, then whether the technique that one is using is a very mundane one or a very profound one, that practice is going to keep one on the direct path to enlightenment. One is assuring oneself that one will not deviate from that path if one has these proper attitudes of refuge and bodhicitta and dedication and aspiration. So one begins any session of practice with the taking of refuge, as we will right now, to begin this session of Shine meditation together, of shamatha. Meditating that in the sky before one, there is a vast assembly of the three jewels and the three roots, the sources of refuge actually present in the space before one. And during the recitation, as we recite the refuge formula several times together, one meditates that oneself and all beings are taking refuge from now until enlightenment is reached in the three jewels and the three roots, in these sources of refuge. And that in seeking this refuge, one is seeking the blessing to overcome and eliminate the sufferings and limitations of samsaric existence, to transcend these and to ultimately attain to enlightenment oneself for the benefit of all beings. So this kind of attitude is quite important during the recitation. Following this recitation, during which time one takes refuge with really heartfelt faith and trust in the three jewels and the three roots, one meditates that from the forms of the sources of refuge before one, light shines and spreads to oneself and all beings, purifying oneself and all beings of obscurations, of negativity and ignorance, and bestowing blessings and awareness, accomplishment of spiritual practice. During the following recitation, the bodhicitta prayers, which are recited 3 times, one's attitude should be one of compassionate and altruistic motivation, considering that all of the infinite numbers of beings that experience the 6 realms of samsara experience those sufferings and experience those frustrations and limitations because there is a fundamental lack of knowledge, a fundamental lack of direct experience in the mind of each and every being. There is the lack of experience of the nature of mind itself, and instead the mind experiences all kinds of illusory projections that are taken for the ultimate reality. And it is this basic misunderstanding, this basic ignorance in the minds of all beings which creates the suffering and the confusion of samsara. So one's motivation in practicing meditation and studying whatever, one's motivation in whatever one does is to benefit all of those beings by not only attaining enlightenment oneself, but leading all other beings to this experience as well. So that there's this emotional confusion and ignorance can be eliminated, and thus the suffering and confusion that they experience can be eliminated, and that all beings can come to attain to that state of enlightenment. That is one's motivation during the recitation. The first Karmapa, Dusum Chempa, said at one point, if you want to see the far mountain, you have to be looking from the near one. That is to say, there is a connection between. One defines the other. If you want the mind to rest, you have to adopt the correct posture. The point being that correct posture is really an important factor in developing good meditation. Now, regardless of whether or not one adopts the full 7-point posture with the legs crossed in full Vajra posture and so forth, depends upon one's own capabilities. The important thing is that the body should be erect, it should be straight, especially the back, the spine should be kept straight during meditation.
Tata San Nepal, Papa the Joan of the San Jopa, the Jin Jopa, the Nyan Jopa Lasupa, Seneg Tak, Lasupayadas, in also Tata and Dirty Practice.
The development of shamatha, of shine, can involve a number of different techniques. Some of these use a form, either a physical form or a visualized form. Some of them are formless states or techniques. There are many different techniques that one could use to develop this quality of shine or shamatha, this tranquility and stability of mind. There are 9 stages recognized by the teachings in the development of mental stability, in the development of mental tranquility. First, the mind is directed towards a particular object or a particular state, and at the second stage it is whenever the mind wanders, it is brought back to that state of awareness, and so forth. There are 9 stages that the texts speak about, which means that it could be described in great detail, but all that we're concerned with at this point is the bare bones. It's just a very brief introduction to the practice of shamatha. Previously we were discussing the nature of mind itself as this empty, clear and unimpeded state of dynamic awareness. That mind is essentially empty or intangible means that the experience of mind itself, rather than any thought or emotion in the mind, the experience of mind itself does not have any tangible flavor or characteristic. It has no color, it has no form, no shape or size or location, but is empty like space, intangible like space. But one cannot simply say that mind is space, because mind exhibits as well a kind of luminous or clear nature in its potential to experience. The fact that the mind can know, is capable of knowing or perceiving or experiencing anything, is its luminosity. And there is also the quality of unimpeded dynamic manifestation, that the mind can manifest as thought, as perception. This is this is that, this is good, this is bad, this is such and such, this is so and so. The fact that the mind can give rise to this kind of awareness is its dynamic or its unimpeded quality. Now this is the nature of mind itself, this empty, this clear, and this unimpeded state of awareness. There's no need to do anything with the mind to create this experience. It is the nature of mind itself to be this way. This approach, which could be described perhaps as looking at emptiness, is in fact a state of bare awareness. There's no need to direct the mind at all, but simply to let the mind relax in its own natural state of empty, clear, and unimpeded awareness. Now, the important point in the beginning is that as thoughts and emotions arise in the mind, as distractions arise, we should not pay attention to these and follow after them, but simply cut them off and return to this state of bare awareness. Even thoughts such as thoughts of faith or compassion, good thoughts, bad thoughts, it doesn't matter. They're all just thoughts, they're all distractions at this point, even good thoughts. The important point is that when any thought arises or any emotion arises, one just cuts it off at that and returns to that state of bare awareness without wandering after the thought. That is quite important. Because this is not an experience that we're used to, the natural relaxation of mind in its own state and the natural relaxation of body, very often people find that when they are meditating in this way that certain physical or mental problems crop up. They get headaches, or they get pains in their body, or the body shakes or trembles, or there's some feeling of insecurity or instability. This is simply because we're not used to that experience of the total relaxation of mind and body. It's simply something we're not ready for. We just aren't used to it. But there are methods that one can use to benefit the situation when those kind of problems crop up. One can adopt a similar approach to the meditation on the spheres of light that we were doing yesterday, which is to say that in this particular formless approach, one still takes the direction in front of one as east, as we were doing yesterday afternoon, regardless of where east is in the outside world. For the point of view of the meditation, the direction in front of one is east. And so one meditates simply directing this empty, clear, and unimpeded state of awareness many miles to the east of one, extending it out into space, as it were, to the east of one, and simply focuses the mind in this empty state of clear awareness without distraction towards the east, towards the direction in front of one's own physical body. In the same way, the direction behind one is the western direction from the point of view of this technique. So at this point, one simply directs the awareness many thousands of miles to the west of one, behind one, still keeping this very spacious, very open state of bare awareness, but directing it in a sense, or focusing it many miles behind one. In the same way, the direction to one's right is the south and to one's left is the north. At this point, one simply directs that empty, spacious state of clear awareness many thousands of miles to the south, to one's right, and rests the mind in that state of experience, that empty and clear and spacious state of awareness, focused many miles to one's south, to one's right. So one can employ this method in any one of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. Another problem which can develop during meditation is the tendency of the mind to become dull, or to sink, or to fade, so that the mind begins to go to sleep. In the most extreme cases, of course, one may actually go to sleep while meditating, but at least there may be the experience of the mind becoming very dull, very heavy, and very thick, so that it's difficult to maintain a clear state of awareness. If that is the case, one can employ the same kind of technique, but instead raising the mind upwards, directing the consciousness many miles upwards, above one, into the sky, into space, and simply maintain this state of clear, empty, spacious awareness, while directing the mind this vast distance above one. Another problem that can arise is that when one meditates, particularly if one meditates longer than one is accustomed to, the mind becomes very wild. It's full of thoughts, very agitated, and it feels as though it's difficult to hold the mind down. It's continually moving with all of these thoughts. One can still use this kind of technique to benefit that situation by lowering the consciousness, maintaining this same state of empty, clear, and unimpeded awareness, formless awareness, but directing it many miles below one, as though down into the earth, and simply direct the consciousness many miles, many thousands of miles even below one, and maintain the awareness in that way. At this point, one can extend the mind, this state of awareness, empty, clear, and unimpeded state of awareness, in all directions at once. The four directions of north, south, east, west, the four intercardinal directions, north, northwest, and southeast, and so forth, and above and below. in the 10 directions all at once. And simply extend the mind thousands of miles if one wishes, in all directions at once, experiencing this spacious state of empty, clear, and unimpeded awareness. So one can use this kind of technique, alternating from one stage to the next. And the reason that one can use this kind of technique, or any kind of technique, is because the mind is essentially empty or intangible, and because it has this dynamic quality of manifestation. So there's no reason to suppose that one somehow can't do the meditation. It's entirely possible to do the meditation. The mind is completely free to express itself in so many different ways. Visually, the mind expresses itself seeing form of all kinds. Through the faculty of hearing, consciousness expresses itself in hearing all kinds of sounds. And the same with smelling smells, tasting tastes, feeling textures. And particularly the mind itself is the creator of ideas and concepts and thoughts and impressions. The mind has this quality to express itself in any way that it chooses. And the same principle applies to meditation as well. It's not that the meditation is impossible. The mind is perfectly capable of meditating any way that one wishes it to. And so the whole process of meditation is much easier, much more straightforward when one understands that. From beginningless time, we have experienced this sense of I. The mind has experienced this sense of an I or self, of a mind in a small sense, this limited little thing. And there has been this impression of a physical body, lifetime after lifetime as well, of the mind in the physical body. So the way we're used to experiencing the mind is this tight little thing somewhere inside the body, inside the head or inside the heart or wherever, stuffed inside the body and held there. Now, of course, if one's meditating with that frame of mind, one's liable to run into problems. It's like a baby being in its mother's womb. And the baby can't really stretch. However much it tries to stretch its arms and legs and move around, it can't. It's compressed in by the walls of the mother's womb, the uterus pressing on the child. Now, in the case of a physical child, that's one thing. But if the mind is not physical, there's no need to treat it like that. But we do. We feel as though the mind is somehow stuffed somewhere inside the physical body and is held there. So when we meditate, it's not surprising that we get headaches and backaches and pains and feelings of uneasiness and palpitations and so forth. What we need to understand is that the mind is in fact intangible, immaterial. And there's no need to treat the mind as though it were this small little ball of hard consciousness somewhere in the body. It simply is not that way. It's only that we're used to experiencing it that way, and have been lifetime after lifetime. So we have a choice. We can either meditate like a mouse in a little cage that has nowhere to go, or we can meditate like a bird flying in the sky that can go anywhere it wants. We have that choice, at least. Perhaps we could conclude the morning teaching with prayers to dedicate the merit and virtue of this teaching for the benefit of all beings.